In the biting grip of a harsh winter, where desperation clung to 19-year-old Leo like frost, a single choice stood between him and the unforgiving streets. His last delivery, his only fragile hope for shelter, hung in the balance against the equally fragile figure of Alara, an elderly woman lost in the deepening twilight. To help her was to invite his own ruin. Yet, in an act of profound, unhesitating kindness, Leo pedaled her towards an unknown future, unaware that this single, selfless journey through the biting cold would not only save her from the encroaching darkness, but irrevocably alter his own destiny, weaving a tapestry of unexpected hope from the threads of despair. Here now is the story of how one cold evening and one warm heart began a journey that would change everything. The wind, a bitter sculptor, had begun to carve the edges of March into something crueler that evening. It was the kind of cold that nipped at exposed ears with spiteful glee and slid, a silent, icy serpent, down the back of your neck, no matter how tightly your coat was buttoned. Along the periphery of Oakhaven, a town weary from a long, unforgiving winter, the sun had already surrendered, dipping prematurely behind the gaunt, thinning trees. Streetlights, waking with a sluggish orange pulse, flickered against the deepening twilight. At the far end of a cracked and forgotten sidewalk, the old No. 7 bus stop sat like a relic of a more connected age. Most people hurried past it, their daily routines a shield against its desolation. Some clutched grocery bags, plastic handles biting into their wrists. Others, faces illuminated by the cold glow of phone screens, navigated digital worlds oblivious to the physical one. Many were simply rushing home, eager to escape the encroaching dark. None of them, it seemed, truly looked at her. The old woman stood alone, a fragile figure wrapped in a beige woolen coat that whispered tales of better decades. Strands of silver hair, fine as spun moonlight, escaped from beneath a once white, now ivory knitted hat. Her small, gloved hands, trembling slightly, clutched a tattered leather purse as if it were a lifeline. With each passing vehicle, her head would turn, a flicker of desperate hope in her eyes, only to fall again as the car sped by. Her lips moved, murmuring fragments, something about the Maple Line, a street name that bore no resemblance to the geography around her. Willow Creek Avenue, or was it Willow Way? Every few moments she'd take a hesitant step towards the curb, only to shuffle back, confusion clouding her pale face like mist on a winter morning. Not far from her, leaning against a graffiti-scarred bench, a young man named Leo had paused to take a long swig from a dented metal water bottle. He was barely 19, his frame stretched thin by a relentless combination of growth spurts and lean times. A hooded jacket, faded from a gradient of too many winters, and a pair of sneakers held together more by ingrained habit than by sound craftsmanship, were his armor against the biting cold. His bicycle, an old trusty steed with a slightly rusted chain, squeaky pedals, and a rickety back rack that threatened mutiny with every bump, leaned beside him. It had belonged to his mother, a vibrant woman whose laughter still echoed in the quietest corners of his memory. After she'd been taken by a swift, merciless illness 2 years prior, the bike had become his everything, his transport, his livelihood, his last tangible link to her. He zipped around Oakhaven on it, a solitary comet, delivering small parcels, groceries, medicine, anything people needed, anything that paid. The earnings were a pittance, barely enough to scrape by, a constant gnawing anxiety. But Leo worked with a quiet, desperate urgency. That evening, he had one last delivery, a crucial one. It was a package for a law firm downtown, and if he made it before they closed at 7, he'd have just enough to cover the week's rent on his small, cold room above a noisy laundromat. If not, well, Mrs. Henderson, his landlady, a woman whose pragmatism often overshadowed her pity, had made it unequivocally clear. The key would no longer fit the lock come morning. The thought sent a fresh chill, colder than the wind, through him. Leo tightened the strap of the worn delivery bag across his chest, the weight of its contents a familiar pressure. He was about to push off, to pedal into the gathering gloom, when his eyes caught the old woman's hesitant movement near the bus stop. There was something about her stillness that snagged his attention, not the patient stillness of someone waiting, but the bewildered stillness of someone adrift. She turned again, her gaze sweeping the empty street, then looked down at her own feet as if even they had become unfamiliar anchors. She muttered something, took another half step forward, then stopped, a small, defeated sigh escaping her lips. Leo hesitated. The clock was a frantic drummer in his chest. Minutes mattered, desperately. The difference between a thin mattress under a leaky roof and the unforgiving embrace of a park bench was this single, time-sensitive delivery. He'd learned the hard way that the world didn't pause for good intentions. But then the wind shifted, carrying her voice faint and shaky across the small distance between them. Elm Street. Or was it Pine Grove? The number 7. It should be here. Her words tumbled like loose, dry leaves, unheard by the hurried footsteps on the sidewalk. No one else seemed to notice her distress, or perhaps they chose not to. Without quite understanding why, propelled by an instinct deeper than self-preservation, Leo found himself walking over, pushing his bike beside him. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly, his voice raspy from the cold and disuse, careful not to startle her. Are you all right?" She blinked at him, her eyes, the color of faded denim, unfocused for a moment, the way one might look at a distant, half-forgotten memory. "Oh," she said, her voice light and wandering, like a melody played on a fragile glass instrument. I was trying to get home, but I think I missed the bus. Or perhaps," a small, brittle laugh, "it missed me." Leo nodded slowly, a knot tightening in his stomach. He knew that laugh. It was the sound of fear trying to disguise itself as nonchalance. "Where do you live, ma'am?" "Maybe I can help you find your way." She looked down at the tattered purse, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. She rummaged through its contents without apparent purpose. A lace-edged handkerchief emerged, then a lipstick tube with no cap, a scattering of loose coins, a few stray buttons, a bus transfer dated 2 days prior. But no address, no identification, nothing that offered a clue. Leo's heart, already heavy with his own anxieties, sank a little further. He was about to suggest calling the police, a prospect that felt like admitting defeat, when something glinted at her throat. A delicate silver chain, almost invisible against the wool of her coat. And at the end of it, nestled just above the collar, a small oval silver locket. He leaned a fraction closer, squinting in the fading light. There, engraved in elegant, looping cursive on the back of the charm, were the words, Alara Vance, 48 Peregrine Crest, Northwood Estates. His breath hitched. Northwood Estates. He knew the area. It was miles away, far past the affluent edge of Oakhaven, a good hour and a half, maybe 2, by bike, and most of it was a relentless, grinding uphill climb. The kind of place where the houses had names instead of just numbers, hidden behind high stone walls and wrought iron gates. For a moment, Leo's mind reeled. The delivery, the deadline, Mrs. Henderson's stern face, the gnawing cold of a night spent unsheltered. He would miss the delivery, no question. He would lose his room. He would almost certainly sleep in the biting cold tonight. The scenarios played out in stark, brutal clarity. But then he looked into Alara Vance's eyes, soft, clouded with age and a disorienting fog, yet with a childlike trust beginning to bloom in their depths, simply because he, a stranger, had stopped and spoken a kind word. He saw his own mother's eyes in them for a fleeting second, in their vulnerability, in their quiet plea for help. He knew, with a certainty that bypassed all logic, that he couldn't walk away. Some choices, he was beginning to understand, carried a weight that couldn't be measured in dollars or minutes, even if they made no earthly sense on paper. He forced a smile, hoping it looked more reassuring than he felt. Peregrine Crest. "That's a bit of a ride, ma'am, but I think we can make it," he said, his voice gentler than he'd intended. He carefully helped her towards his bicycle, his movements slow and deliberate. The back rack wasn't designed for passengers, but he'd MacGyvered it many times for heavy loads. He untied his spare, threadbare scarf from the handlebars and wrapped it around the cold metal of the rack to offer some meager padding. Then he shrugged off his own faded, precious jacket and carefully draped it around her narrow shoulders. The wind immediately found the thin fabric of his T-shirt, its icy fingers probing. "Hold on tight now, Mrs. Vance. All right? We'll go slow and steady." She chuckled, a sound less brittle this time, dazed, but infused with a surprising gratitude. "You remind me of someone," she murmured, her voice gaining a little strength as she settled precariously. "My grandson, Thomas. He used to wear shoes just like those, always scuffed, always proud of how far they'd taken him." Leo didn't correct her, didn't mention that pride had little to do with his worn sneakers. Necessity was their sole architect. He just nodded, gave a small, reassuring pat to her hand where it gripped the rack, and began to pedal. Slowly at first, finding their balance, then more steadily as they left the flickering lights of Oak Haven's weary downtown behind them. The sky bled from lavender to a bruised plum, then to an inky, star-pricked black. The road sloped upwards, bent around dark copses of trees, and stretched seemingly endlessly before them. But Leo kept going, his breath pluming in the frigid air, his legs burning with a dull, persistent ache. Each turn of the pedal, each rhythmic squeak of the old chain, echoed with a sense of quiet, almost defiant purpose. Behind him, Alara hummed a wavering, half-forgotten tune. Sometimes she would trail off, lost in thought. Sometimes she would ask, her voice small against the whistling wind, "Are we nearly there, young man?" And then, minutes later, as if the question were brand new, "Where are we going again, dear?" He answered every time, his voice patient, as if it were the first time she'd asked. "We're getting closer, Mrs. Vance. Don't you worry. Just over the next hill, I reckon." The wind grew sharper, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. The street lamps became rarer, islands of weak light in a vast ocean of darkness. But Leo kept his eyes fixed forward, his focus unwavering. They passed fields sleeping under a thin blanket of frost, crossed narrow bridges where the only illumination came from the cold, distant moon, and paused once, at the crest of a particularly punishing incline, for Alara to catch her breath and for Leo to massage the cramping muscles in his thighs. He spotted a lonely, all-night gas station, its fluorescent lights a beacon in the wilderness. With the last crumpled dollar and some loose change from his pocket, money he'd mentally allocated for a half-loaf of day-old bread tomorrow, he bought her a small cup of hot tea. As he handed it to her, her gloved fingers fumbled slightly. "You take the first sip, dear," she insisted, her voice imbued with a tender sternness that resonated with a painfully familiar echo of his own mother. "You need it more than I do. You're working so hard." He did, the warmth of brief, shocking comfort against the pervasive chill. It was nearly 9:30, well past the law firm's closing time, when the gates of 48 Peregrine Crest finally appeared. They were whitewashed stone pillars, grand and imposing, with intricate ivy-entwined wrought-iron gates. Even in the dim light, the house beyond hinted at a quiet, established opulence. Leo's legs ached, with a profound, bone-deep weariness. His hands were numb, and his lungs burned with every breath, but a wave of immense relief washed over him. He'd made it. She was home. He leaned the bike against one of the pillars and, after gently helping Alara dismount, knocked once on a heavy oak side door set into the garden wall. Then again, a little louder. Moments later, the door creaked open, spilling warm yellow light onto the frosted path. An older man, distinguished-looking even in a velvet housecoat and slippers, stood framed in the doorway. His expression, initially one of anxious inquiry, transformed into wide-eyed disbelief, then profound relief, as he saw Alara huddled behind Leo. "Mrs. Vance! Alara! Oh, my heavens, where have you been? We've been frantic. Calling hospitals, the police." His voice trembled. Alara looked around, a little dazed, then blinked again, as if surfacing from a deep dream. "Arthur, dear, I believe I went for a walk, or perhaps a ride," she said, a faint sweet smile gracing her lips as she looked at Leo. "This very kind young man brought me home." Arthur, who Leo surmised was a butler or caretaker, thanked him profusely, his voice still shaking with residual panic and overwhelming gratitude. "Please, young man, you must come inside. Warm yourself. Have something to eat, something hot to drink. Let us at least give you a ride back to town. It's the least we can do." But Leo, weary to his core, yet strangely content, shook his head. "No need, sir, thank you. I should get back before it gets any colder." The thought of his locked room, his meager belongings on the step, was a dull ache, but the satisfaction of having seen this through outweighed it, just barely. He scribbled his phone number, a pay-as-you-go burner he rarely had credit on, onto a torn corner of a grocery receipt he found in his pocket. "Here," he said, handing it to Arthur. In case you ever need help again, or if she wanders." And with that, he swung his leg back over his mother's old bicycle, gave a small nod, and rode off into the cold, indifferent darkness. He was acutely unaware that his room would indeed be locked, his few possessions already bundled outside, his thin mattress likely already claimed by another soul desperate for shelter. But he was also blissfully unaware that something far more significant, far more life-altering, had just been set into motion by the simple, unwavering weight of his kindness. The ride back to Oakhaven was a descent into a colder, starker reality. The streetlights in the town center, when he finally reached them, seemed to offer little warmth, their orange glow mocking. The brief comfort of the gas station tea had long since faded from his hands. His knuckles were stiff, aching with every jolt from the uneven road that rattled up through the handlebars and into his bones. But he didn't complain, not even to himself. The journey back was quieter, lonelier, without the gentle, sometimes confused voice behind him, or the small, trusting weight of someone depending on him to keep pedaling. The wind had picked up again, a mournful dirge whistling through the skeletal branches of the winter-bare trees. It carried with it the metallic tang of impending snow and the bitter, acrid scent of wood smoke from distant chimneys, the perfume of Oakhaven after 9. Leo coasted the last block to his boarding house, a narrow 2-story clapboard building with paint peeling like sunburnt skin and a porch light that had surrendered to the darkness months ago. He parked his bike quietly against the rickety porch railing, climbed the creaking wooden steps, and reached into his pocket for the key. An empty space. At first, a flicker of denial. He must have reached into the wrong pocket. He patted down his thin jacket, then his jeans, a growing dread coiling in his stomach. Every corner, every seam. Nothing. The key was gone. Lost somewhere on that long, dark ride, perhaps? Or... He knocked softly on Mrs. Henderson's door, the one marked landlady, hoping against hope she might still be awake, might show a sliver of mercy. No lights flickered on inside. He knocked again, a little louder, the sound echoing hollowly in the silent street. Nothing. When he tried the doorknob to his own room, it didn't budge. Locked, firmly. Then, as if to confirm the brutal, inevitable truth, his gaze fell upon a small, pathetic bundle beside his door. His spare shirt, a threadbare towel, his cracked phone charger, all stuffed haphazardly into a translucent plastic grocery bag, looking like yesterday's forgotten trash. Taped to his door was a small, square piece of paper. 3 words stark and final, written in thick black marker, past due. Locks changed. His breath caught in his throat, a painful, ragged sound. He stood there for a long, frozen minute, his faithful bike leaning beside him, a silent witness. He wasn't sure whether to curse the injustice of it all, to rage at his own foolish kindness, or to simply sit down on the cold steps and cry. He did none of those. Instead, with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his 19 years, Leo turned back towards the unwelcoming lights of the town center. His legs screamed in protest from the monumental ride to Northwood Estates and back, but he didn't let them rest. He pedaled slowly, methodically, knowing there was nowhere specific left for him to go, but needing to keep moving. The cold was beginning to seep into his chest now. A deep, invasive chill, and stillness would only make it worse. It was nearly midnight when he found himself coasting down the narrow back alley behind Henderson's Market, a small, family-run corner store where he sometimes helped Mr. Henderson, the stoic, elderly owner, restock shelves or sweep up in exchange for day-old bread and a few crumpled dollars. Mr. Henderson was kind, in the gruff, unspoken way older men often were to kids they saw struggling, kids who didn't ask for help but clearly needed it. He was gruff, often scowling, but never cruel. Leo parked his bike behind the overflowing dumpster, its metallic tang a familiar scent. He knocked once, a hesitant tap, on the dented steel side door and waited, shivering. A light flickered on inside. A few seconds later, the door creaked open a few inches, revealing Mr. Henderson, his shoulders hunched, wearing a heavy flannel robe and holding a steaming mug that smelled of something strong and vaguely medicinal. He took one look at Leo, shivering, hollow-eyed, the plastic bag of his worldly possessions clutched in one hand, and let out a long, weary sigh that seemed to come from his boots. "Didn't make rent, huh, son?" It wasn't a question. Leo just shook his head, words failing him. Mr. Henderson looked up at the starless, unforgiving sky for a moment, as if waiting for some celestial guidance, or perhaps just confirming the lateness of the hour. Then he stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Well, ain't no sense in you freezing to death out there. The storeroom's dry, and there's an old cot in the corner. Just don't touch the good wine crates, and try not to knock anything over." Leo nodded, a wave of profound, exhausted gratitude washing over him. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. He stepped inside. The storeroom smelled of cardboard, overripe citrus, and a faint hint of mothballs. The only heat came from an ancient radiator in the corner that groaned and hissed like a disgruntled old man with a grudge against the world. Leo didn't mind. He found the cot, pulled the thin, scratchy blanket around his shoulders, and let himself collapse onto the thin mattress. His limbs were heavy, his chest sore, but his heart, strangely, was quiet. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, he wasn't consumed by the immediate frantic fear of where his next meal or his next night's sleep would come from. Something about the ride, about Alara Vance's small, trusting hand on his shoulder, her fragmented humming in the dark, the sheer, unexpected kindness he'd received from Mr. Henderson, had made the jagged edges of the world feel a little less sharp, a little less menacing. He drifted to sleep, not thinking of the locked door and the lost room behind him, but of a delicate silver locket, the soft rhythmic hum of wheels turning on gravel, and a gentle voice that had said, "You remind me of someone I loved." Outside, the winter wind howled against the brick walls of Henderson's Market, a mournful, lonely sound. But inside the small, cluttered storeroom, Leo slept deeply and soundly for the first time in a long while. Unaware that miles away in a grand house filled with shadows and silence, a woman sat by her kitchen window, now fully awake, the fog in her mind having finally, blessedly, lifted. In her lap was the beige woolen coat she had worn, Leo's faded jacket still draped over a nearby chair, and in her hand, smoothed out and treasured, was a torn, grease-stained corner of a grocery receipt. On it, a phone number scrawled in uneven, hurried blue ink. Ilara Vance, no longer lost, no longer adrift, stared at the paper, her gaze clear and intensely focused. She whispered his name, Leo, like a prayer, like a promise. It was the first truly warm, hopeful word she'd spoken into the quiet, lonely expanse of her house in years. The morning arrived with a hush, pale and hesitant, as if the sky itself were unsure whether to fully commit to waking. A soft gray light crept across the back room of Henderson's Market, filtering through the small, dust-frosted window and settling over the quiet, curled form of Leo beneath the thin blanket. The cold clung to the walls, slipped through the cracks in the old window frame, and wrapped itself around his bones. But he didn't stir. Not yet. His body ached with the particular deep-seated soreness that follows a night of profound exertion and a hard cot. But deeper still was the familiar heaviness that lived in his chest, the kind that came not from physical strain, but from too many days spent balancing survival on a threadbare wire. When he did finally rise, it was without complaint, a habit born of long practice. He folded the blanket with a meticulous care that seemed out of place in the cluttered storeroom, tucked it neatly against the wall, and moved quietly toward the front of the store. The rubber soles of his worn sneakers were almost silent on the cracked linoleum floor. Mr. Henderson was already there, of course, a fixture as reliable as the sunrise. He was going through the stoic, methodical routine of opening up, a man who had long ago learned that consistency was its own form of faith, perhaps its own kind of solace. He grunted, a sound that served as his customary greeting when he saw Leo, then pushed a slightly bruised banana and a half-warmed cup of instant coffee in a chipped mug across the counter toward him. No words, just that quiet, undemanding acknowledgement, the kind that, to Leo, often meant more than a torrent of conversation. Leo took the banana with a quiet, "Thanks," peeled it slowly, and stood by the front window, watching as Oakhaven exhaled into reluctant motion. Steam rose from the hoods of parked cars, ghostly breath in the cold air. A few early-bird children, bundled like miniature Michelin men, shuffled along sidewalks clutching their backpacks. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, a sharp, lonely sound, and then was silent. It was just another day, another morning that looked, on the surface, like all the ones that had come before it. Until the black car pulled up. It was the kind of car that didn't belong on these gritty workaday streets. Too polished, too quiet, too sleek. It glided to the curb with an understated elegance, like it was answering a summons from a different, more rarefied world. The man who stepped out was tall and lean, his dark overcoat impeccably tailored, a stark contrast to the faded storefronts. His shoes were unscuffed, his posture deliberate, radiating an air of quiet authority. He glanced at a slip of paper in his gloved hand, then looked directly through the store window. His gaze, sharp and discerning, landing on Leo as if he had always known precisely where to find him. When the bell over the shop door chimed, a cheerful, incongruous sound, and the man stepped inside. The small, cluttered space seemed to shrink around his presence. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth, cultured, but with an undeniable weight beneath it. "I'm looking for a young man named Leo." Leo turned from the window, the half-eaten banana suddenly tasteless in his mouth. He was frozen for just a breath, his heart thudding against his ribs like a trapped bird. That's me," he said, his voice cautious, a knot of apprehension tightening in his chest. Had he done something wrong? Was this about Alara? Was she okay? The man's expression, initially formal and unreadable, softened perceptibly with relief. "Ah, excellent. Miss Alara Vance sent me," he said, the name sending a jolt through Leo. "She asked me to find you. She remembers everything from last night, Mr. Leo, and she wishes to thank you properly. She was most insistent." Mr. Henderson, who had been observing this exchange with a stoic lack of expression, paused mid-sip of his coffee, his bushy eyebrows rising a fraction. He said nothing, but his gaze was sharp and curious. Leo looked from the impeccably dressed man, Arthur, he now vaguely recalled from the brief exchange at Alara's gate, down to the crumpled receipt still clutched in his own hand. His own messy handwriting, the number he'd scribbled almost as an afterthought, never truly expecting it to be used, certainly not like this. It hadn't been meant as anything more than a fragile lifeline, a gesture. Arthur, for it was indeed him, held the shop door open, gesturing with a gloved hand towards the gleaming black car idling at the curb. "She's waiting at the house if you're willing to come. She'd very much like to speak with you." Leo hesitated. 1,000 conflicting thoughts and emotions warred within him. Gratitude that Alara was okay. Confusion, a deep-seated reluctance. The idea of going back to that grand house, of stepping into a world so utterly alien to his own, felt like being asked to walk barefoot onto a polished, unfamiliar ballroom floor. He was just a delivery boy, homeless, with no family, no safety net, no clear finish line in sight. He had done what felt right, what anyone with a shred of decency should have done. That was all. I just wanted to make sure she got home safe," he said, his voice quiet but firm, his gaze steady. "That's all it was. She doesn't owe me anything." Arthur regarded him for a long moment, neither offended by the reluctance nor overly insistent. His expression was thoughtful. "And you did ensure her safety, for which we are all profoundly grateful," he replied, his tone respectful. "But she believes you gave her more than just directions home, Leo. She said you gave her back a piece of herself she thought was lost. She would very much like to tell you that in person." Leo glanced towards Mr. Henderson, who, after a moment, gave a barely perceptible shrug, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both his usual gruff indifference and a surprising undercurrent of concern, perhaps even encouragement. "Go on, son," Mr. Henderson grunted, finally breaking his silence. "Your cot'll still be here if you need it tonight. And that banana ain't eaten itself." With a deep breath that felt too large for his chest, a breath that tasted of cold air and bewildering possibility, Leo nodded slowly. He followed Arthur out of the familiar, dusty confines of Henderson's Market and into the unfamiliar plush interior of the waiting car. The drive to Northwood Estates was surreal in the daylight. The trees that had loomed like menacing, skeletal shadows the night before now stood tall and still, venerable sentinels guarding some secret sun-dappled forest path. The turns in the road felt shorter, the hills less steep, less punishing, but Leo still remembered every one of them, each stone and slope etched into the muscle memory of his aching legs. When they reached the grand, whitewashed house, it no longer looked like an imposing, distant monument, but rather like a memory, softened and made strangely familiar by the shared ordeal of the previous night. Arthur led him not through the imposing front entrance, but through the same side garden door, into a room filled with the soft glow of morning sun, the comforting scent of old books and beeswax, and a profound, quiet warmth. There, seated by a large bay window that overlooked a meticulously tended winter garden, was Alara Vance. She was not the dazed, wandering woman from the bus stop. The transformation was astonishing. Her silver hair was neatly pinned. Her eyes, though still the color of faded denim, were sharp, intelligent, and filled with a clear, focused light. She wore a simple but elegant cashmere dress in a soft shade of lavender. When she saw Leo enter, a genuine, radiant smile broke over her face, like morning sunlight cresting over misty mountains. "Leo," she breathed, her voice trembling just enough to betray the depth of her emotion. "You came. Oh, my dear boy, you brought me home." She reached for his hands, her grip surprisingly firm, gentle but insistent. Her skin felt cool, like old parchment. "I remember everything now, Leo. Every street, every kind word. You didn't treat me like a nuisance or a confused old woman. You treated me with such patience, such care. You made me feel safe." Leo bowed his head slightly, unsure what to say, where to look. The warmth of her praise, the intensity of her gratitude, felt too large, too overwhelming for the simple act he had performed. It was just a bike ride, albeit a long and difficult one. But Alara wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her gaze searching his, trying to read the story etched in the lines of weariness around his young eyes. "I don't know your story, Leo," she said softly, "but I sense it hasn't been an easy one, and I would like to know it if you're willing to share. More importantly," she paused, her eyes glistening, "if you don't have a place to go, a safe place to rest your head, I would be deeply honored if you would consider accepting one here. Not just for tonight or this week. For longer if you'd let me. This old house has far too many empty rooms, and not nearly enough kindness or youthful spirit within its walls. You would change that, I think." Leo blinked, the offer catching him completely off guard. It was generous, astonishingly so, more than generous. And yet something in him, a stubborn knot of pride, of ingrained self-reliance, resisted. He took a small, unconscious step back, his voice low but steady. That's incredibly kind of you, Mrs. Vance. Really. But I didn't do what I did to get anything in return. I just wanted to make sure you were safe. That's all." Hilara's eyes didn't waver. A soft, knowing smile touched her lips. "And that, my dear Leo," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "is precisely why I want you to stay. Because you didn't do it for reward. That kind of integrity is rare and precious." He didn't answer right away. The silence between them stretched, gentle but taut with unspoken emotions, filled with a feeling that neither of them could quite name. It was the dawning of something new, something unexpected. Though Leo would, true to Mr. Henderson's word, return to the market that night and sleep again in the cluttered storeroom and wake once more to the familiar chill and the scent of cardboard, something profound had shifted within him and in the grand house on Peregrine Crest. He had been seen, truly seen, not for what he lacked, for his poverty or his homelessness, but for what he carried within him. The quiet, steady, unwavering light of someone who showed up, who cared, even when no one was watching, even when it cost him dearly. And far from the dusty storeroom, in that sunlit room overlooking the winter garden, Alara Vance sat with a heart that felt less alone, less shadowed by the past than it had in many, many years. She was already preparing for tomorrow, for when she would offer again, not out of charity, not out of pity, but out of a deep, resonant recognition. Because sometimes she was beginning to understand. Family is not about who we are born to, but about who we choose. or who chooses us to walk home with in the dark. And sometimes, a life isn't changed by a grand gesture, but by the quiet accumulation of small, decent acts and the courage to accept the kindness offered in return. The next morning dawned with a gentler sky, brushed with faint streaks of pale gold that peeked shyly through the faded curtain of cloud, as if the sun itself were hesitant to intrude on the quiet stillness of the day. Inside the back room of Henderson's Market, Leo had risen early as always. He'd swept the floor with a worn broom, the rhythmic swish-swish of familiar comfort, and had begun organizing a newly delivered stack of canned goods into neat, quiet stacks. His mind, however, was not on the labels or the satisfying order of the shelves. It was too full of Elara Vance's visit the day before, of her astonishing offer, of the look in her clear, intelligent eyes. He had replayed her words, her smile, the warmth of her hand, through the long, cold hours of the night, again and again. Each syllable, each gesture, lingered like the last, resonant note of a hymn that refused to fade. Her presence had not overwhelmed the sun-filled room in her house. It had warmed it, illuminated it. And yet, Leo had not known what to do with such a gift, such an unexpected sanctuary. He'd never had anything offered so freely, so tenderly, and certainly not from someone who looked at him not with pity or judgment, but with a kind of hopeful expectation. As he set down a box of tinned peaches, the bell over the shop door jingled. Not in the usual impatient clatter of a regular customer eager for their morning paper or milk, but in a soft, measured chime that felt familiar. He looked up from behind the counter, his heart giving an odd little jump. And there she was again, Elara Vance. This time, there was no Arthur, no gleaming black car. She stood in the doorway, a wool shawl in a soft heather hue wrapped neatly over her shoulders, a small, well-loved leather handbag tucked into the crook of her arm. She looked, he thought, like someone's kind grandmother, albeit one with an undeniable air of quiet dignity. Her expression was gentle, her eyes already searching the dim interior of the store for him, as if she knew, with an uncanny certainty, exactly where he would be. Leo straightened instinctively, his hands wiping unconsciously on the worn fabric of his jeans as he stepped forward from behind the counter. She smiled when she saw him, a genuine, unreserved smile that reached her eyes and walked towards him. Not with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to commanding space, but with the quiet grace of someone who had decided, deliberately, to share it. "Good morning, Leo," she said softly, her voice warmer than the hesitant morning light filtering through the dusty shop window. "I hope you don't mind me coming by again. I've been thinking about you. All night, in fact." She paused, a slight flush rising on her high cheekbones. "I suppose that sounds rather strange, but I mean it kindly." Leo just nodded, not trusting his voice just yet. A lump had formed in his throat, a mixture of surprise, gratitude, and a bewildering sense of being valued. She looked around the small, cluttered store, her gaze taking in the stacked shelves, the worn counter, the faint scent of floor polish and old newsprint. Then she leaned a little closer, as though what she was about to say belonged only to the air between them, a fragile, precious confidence. "I've lived in that big, quiet house on Peregrine Crest for a very long time, Leo," she began, her voice dropping to a more intimate tone, "and it has never felt so empty, so profoundly silent as it did this morning. Not even after my dear husband, Walter, passed away. Not even after—" She trailed off, her gaze momentarily distant, shadowed by a private grief. She drew a small, steadying breath. "My grandson, Thomas. You remind me of him, you know. His kindness, his eyes, the way he always seemed to listen more than he spoke. He was a good boy. a kind soul. She paused, and Leo saw a flicker of deep, old pain in her eyes before she blinked it away. When you helped me the other night, Leo, when you were so patient, so selfless, without asking for anything, without expecting anything, something in me woke up, something that had been sleeping, dormant, for many, many years. Leo looked down at his own hands, resting on the edge of the counter, the tips of his fingers curling slightly against the cool formica. He felt a strange ache in his chest, an echo of her unspoken sorrow, and a dawning understanding of her loneliness. Alara reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was thick, creamy stationery, the kind he'd only ever seen in shop windows. There were lines of ink, handwritten in a slightly trembling but elegant script. "This is not a contract, Leo," she said, holding it out to him. "It's not a deal or an arrangement or a debt to be repaid. It's simply an invitation and a hope. I have a home, as I said, with too many rooms and too few reasons to keep them all closed and silent. I would like you to come and stay, just until you find your footing, until you decide what you want to do next. There are no strings attached, Leo, only support. And perhaps," she added, a wistful smile touching her lips, "a bit of companionship for a lonely old woman." Leo took the note, his fingers brushing hers. He unfolded it slowly. It was, as she'd said, an offer to stay at the estate. There was a mention of a modest monthly stipend. "For personal expenses," she had written, and then, beneath that, in a softer, more flowing script, almost an afterthought, a promise. "We'll find a way for you to return to school, perhaps finish your studies, if that is something you still desire." He didn't speak for a long time. The sounds of Oakhaven waking up outside the shop window, the rumble of a delivery truck, the distant siren, the laughter of children on their way to school, seemed to recede, to move as if through thick syrup. The entire world outside this small, quiet moment seemed to hold its breath, unaware that inside this little corner store, something important, something life-altering, was quietly, irrevocably shifting. Finally, Leo looked up from the note, his gaze meeting hers directly. The fear, the hesitation, the ingrained reluctance of a young man who had learned to expect nothing and trust no one was still there, but something else was present too. A flicker of hope, a dawning sense of possibility, a tentative, fragile trust. He began, his voice a little hoarse. He cleared his throat. "I'd like that, Mrs. Vance," he said, the words feeling both enormous and incredibly simple. "I'd like to come." A slow, radiant smile spread across Alara Vance's face, chasing away the last of the shadows from her eyes. "Oh, Leo," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "That makes me very happy. Please call me Alara." And so he did. That afternoon, Arthur came by with the car. Not out of any sense of ceremony, Alara had explained, but because she insisted that Leo not ride that creaking old bicycle up the long, punishing hill to Northwood Estates again, not with his few belongings. He packed his meager possessions, the spare shirt, the towel, the cracked charger, a well-loved dog-eared paperback his mother had given him, into a new, sturdy backpack Alara had sent along with Arthur. He said goodbye to Mr. Henderson, who merely nodded, his expression unreadable as ever, but who then surprised Leo by thrusting a paper bag into his hands. Inside were 2 enormous corned beef sandwiches and a crisp apple. "'Bout time someone looked out for you, son," Mr. Henderson had muttered, turning away quickly to busy himself behind the counter. Then Leo climbed into the back seat of the gleaming black car, a vehicle that smelled faintly and rather wonderfully of pine needles and possibility. As they pulled away from the curb, leaving Henderson's market and the gritty streets of his old life behind, he didn't look back. He looked forward. Life at Peregrine Crest was not, as he might have imagined, one of stifling formality or extravagant, overwhelming luxury. It was peaceful, quietly structured. Alara, he quickly learned, was a woman of simple habits and profound intellect. She was wealthy, yes. The estate was a testament to her late husband's success in an industry Leo didn't quite understand. But she lived without ostentation. Her true wealth, he began to see, lay in her wisdom, her quiet empathy, and her vast library. Leo was given a sunlit room at the back of the house, overlooking a sprawling, slightly wild garden that sloped down towards a distant line of trees. It had a comfortable bed, a sturdy desk, and shelves already filled with books Alara thought he might enjoy. His days settled into a new rhythm, one that allowed him to rest, to read, to eat regular, nourishing meals, and most importantly, to breathe. Within the month, true to her word, Alara, with Arthur's discreet assistance, had arranged for him to re-enroll at the local community college to finish his high school equivalency, and then, if he wished, to pursue further studies. A small private scholarship fund, she explained, had been established by her late husband for promising young individuals facing adversity. Leo suspected she'd just created it, quietly, in his name. She never paraded his story, never treated him like a charity case or a pet project. Instead, she welcomed him into the gentle, unhurried rhythm of her days. There were morning walks in the sprawling, slightly overgrown greenhouse, where she tended to her collection of orchids and ferns with a surprisingly deft touch. There were long, unhurried discussions over afternoon tea in the sun-drenched library, where they talked about everything from the books he was reading for his classes to the news of the day, to her memories of a world long past. Weekends were often filled with ideas, with quiet brainstorming sessions about what they could do, what they should do, with the time and resources they now, in a way, shared. It was during one of these conversations, sitting by the crackling fireplace, as an early autumn chill settled over the gardens, that the idea began to take shape. Alara had been speaking of her late grandson, Thomas, of his idealism, his passionate desire to make a difference, a desire cut tragically short. Leo, emboldened by her trust and the growing confidence he felt in himself, spoke of the countless other young people he knew or knew of in Oakhaven, kids with talent, with dreams, but with no clear path, no support system, facing the same struggles he had. He spoke of the elderly, like Alara herself had been that day at the bus stop, who slipped through the cracks, forgotten and vulnerable. Together, they created something Alara had long dreamed of, but had never quite found the impetus, or perhaps the right partner, to build alone. A small, independent foundation funded from her estate. They called it the Willow Light Fund, in honor of the street name she couldn't quite remember that fateful evening, and the enduring, illuminating kindness she would never, ever forget. Its mission was deceptively simple: to provide support and create opportunities for young people with potential but no clear path, to offer shelter and care to the elderly who had become isolated or lost, and, fundamentally, to remind anyone who was listening, anyone who cared to see, that dignity, kindness, and care were not luxuries to be earned, but fundamental human birthrights. Leo, now a young man with a quiet confidence that belied his turbulent past, helped design the first programs. He met with local social workers and community counselors, his own lived experiences providing invaluable, practical insights. He even started working part-time at a dilapidated community center in one of Oakhaven's roughest neighborhoods, a center the Willow Light Fund had begun to renovate and revitalize. He found he had a knack for connecting with the kids there, for seeing the spark of potential beneath the layers of bravado or despair. Every so often, on a crisp Saturday morning, Leo would still take his mother's old, now carefully maintained bicycle out for a ride into town. Not because he had to, not for deliveries, but because it reminded him. It reminded him of where he had begun, of the biting cold and the gnawing hunger, but also of his mother's love, and of the profound, almost miraculous way one small, uncertain act of grace, offered without expectation, could grow, could blossom, could change everything. And each time he passed the old, disused bus stop at the far end of that cracked sidewalk, the one where it had all begun, he would slow down just a little. He would tip his head towards the wide, open sky, feel the wind on his face, no longer a cruel, biting enemy, but a familiar, bracing companion, and he would smile. Because sometimes, he knew now, you don't find a home. Sometimes, if you're very, very lucky, home finds you. And sometimes, all it truly takes to change the course of a life, or two lives, or many, is the simple, courageous willingness to stop, to truly see someone in their moment of need, and to be willing to ride a little farther, to give a little more than you ever planned. The weight of kindness, he had learned, was the most beautiful, most uplifting burden of all. Leo's journey with Alar began with a single, difficult choice fueled by compassion. What would you have done in his shoes? Has a moment of unexpected kindness ever profoundly changed your path or the path of someone you know? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If stories like this, filled with hope and the incredible power of human connection, resonate with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to hit that notification bell so you won't miss out on more heartwarming tales that inspire and uplift. Join us